welcome to the session AZ305. Basically, in this session, we will be talking about design perspectives when we talk about planning our infrastructure. So, the tools and services, what we will be discussing here is basically you might have gone through these services prior, but the agenda of discussing those here is in design perspective. So basically, prior to this, you might have gone through and understanding what those services helps you achieve. Now, once we have the understanding of all the services, resources, which will help you build your infrastructure. Now, when we are planning that infrastructure, how and where can we place those resources and achieve a solution, an infrastructural solution for an organization is what we will be looking at. So in simple terms, we are going to talk about design perspective of using all the resources. Now, if I talk about your VMs, if I talk about your containerized services, if I talk about your serverless architecture, we might have seen these services individually, but the whole point of view of discussing those services here, more or less, I'm just giving an example. There could be other services also, but when we are implementing that, we are building an infrastructure for an organization where we would place those services. In what situations I would tend to choose either to go with VM, either to go with your containerized services, either to opt managed services, either to opt your serverless architecture. So the design perspective of an organization is what we are going to discuss and understand. So on the very first part, what we are looking at is, as you can see, we are talking about designing an infrastructural solution. Now, solutions can be in terms of governance, in terms of your computing options, in terms of your storage options, in terms of database solutions. Now, it could be in all possible aspects. That is in terms of compute, in terms of storage, in terms of networking, and in terms of DB solutions, right? So slowly and gradually, we would be talking about all those aspects, how things would play a role from a design perspective. So for now, we are going to talk about your designing solution in terms of governance. So when an organization needs to place governance into your infrastructure, what are all the components you would bring in, what you would utilize, and how you would place them is what we are looking at. So if I go ahead and look at this, when we talk about designing a governance solution, more or less, we will be talking about your topics in terms of subscriptions, at what times, how you would use different subscriptions. You will talk about Azure policies. We will talk about Azure RBACs. We will talk about Azure blueprints, how these will help you have a better governance across your organization. That is what we are taking as an understanding, right? So if I talk about governance, basically, these are all the major things which you would think of. That is in terms of your governance scopes, or basically we say there are multiple scopes using which I can have governance at all the levels throughout my organization. So we have already seen what a tenant group is, what your management groups helps achieve, what are all the different subscriptions what we hold, what are resource groups, and how you will utilize resources. Now, just to recall things, what we say is when at what times I would go ahead and bring in management group as a solution for an organization. So we say whenever you're dealing with multiple departments in an organization, managing them becomes a huge task. So to have an hierarchical approach, we go ahead and create a management group as a scope where you will have a tenant group above, right? A root group above, within which I can have multiple different management groups. Along with that, who could be having multiple other working groups and different resources being a part of these management groups. So that is the time when I have multiple departments in place and I want to have governance in infrastructure. I would utilize these management groups or these scopes as a entry point for defining different requirements or different restrictions across my organization, or basically bring in governance in my organization. So I have got management groups, I have got subscriptions, I have got resource groups, and individually there are resources onto which I can apply my governance. So management group, we have understood that if I have multiple teams, multiple different teams to work together, I would want to bring in your dev, your tests, your production teams along, and also have a logical separation between all these teams. I would go ahead and create my management groups accordingly, which again acts as a scope. Now, scope, we know that we have got different levels of scopes. Now, these scopes allows us applying restrictions or any policies which I would want to apply across my organization. I could utilize these scopes to be my level of action in an organization, right? And as we know, the higher the scope where I apply, all the sub part or the sub scopes or the child resources would automatically inherit those restrictions or policies what I apply, right? So we have got your management groups in place. We have different subscription. So basically, we know when we move towards our next scope, we say I have got different subscriptions in place. I can have dedicated subscriptions assigned to dedicated teams, where if I say my agenda is to have a dev team and I want to dedicate a subscription to my development team without involving any other subscription, I can have a dedicated subscription to my dev team. Similarly, I can have my test environment. I can have my subscription dedicated to test. If I have my production environment, I can have a dedicated subscription for my production environment as well. So basically, it is not bound for me to have a single subscription. In my organization, I could have multiple different subscription. Now, as we know, subscription plays a role in terms of addressing the billing challenges what we could come across when we have to utilize our resources. So without a subscription, it is not possible for you to go ahead and launch any resources. Hence, having a subscription in place is very important. Along with that, we are understanding that there are different subscriptions, or we could have multiple subscriptions in an organization dedicated to different teams, that also acting as a scope, right? Similarly, once we have this, you can go ahead and group your resources. As we have seen, we have understood RG, resource group. What does this allow? In a nutshell, if we understand that resource group basically helps us group set of resources. Right now, as we move further, we will try to much more understand why, in what places we would bring in. I'm just having a discussion that these are the scopes, these are the levels onto which I can bring in my governance and bring a structured layer or a structured approach in my infrastructure, right? So once we have this understanding, let's move towards understanding different subscriptions, when to use, how to utilize it. So you can see a couple of discussions where we say, if I have different business needs, right? As we discussed, dedicated to dev environment, dedicated to test environment, dedicated to your production environment, I could have my subscriptions placed accordingly, right? I might also have different considerations which I can bring in to go ahead and manage my subscriptions, right? So basically, if I would want to have a consolidated approach or a dedicated subscription for a dedicated set of services, right? The approach could be anything, guys. For having multiple subscriptions, there are multiple agendas based on your organizations. You would choose at what times, how you would want to utilize a subscription. So with that, we also understand that at the point where it is helping us achieve my billing aspect, it also allows me a level of scope where I could have governance. Now, governance and what terms? So we will see when we try to put all these things together, right? Now, you have the same approach what we discussed, where we are saying that I might have different departments within management groups, and for those departments I have dedicated subscriptions associated to those departments, so that I don't mix up or have a single subscription who is addressing all the billing aspects of different groups, right? So that is what we are going ahead and utilizing different subscriptions for. Now, similarly, if I talk about your resource group, as I discussed, that is basically when we talk about resource group, the whole agenda of having a resource group is that I might have different set of services launched across, but I would want to logically group them. Now, the agenda of logically grouping could be centralized management, or they could be sharing similar life cycle, right? The purpose could be anything, but here we are understanding that once we have resource groups in place where this will help us achieve grouping of different resources within them, we also understand that within this structure of infrastructure, you have got a resource group, that is RG, also to be playing a role as a scope, where now not only I can manage in terms of root group, subgroups also helps me achieve governance at all these level, right? I under my root, I have got management. Under my management, I have got my subscriptions. Under my subscriptions, I have got my resource groups, and under my resource groups are my resources. So all these levels gives me a scope onto which I can achieve governance. Now, either I would want to manage a single resource, then I would want to have resource itself to be a scope. I might have set of resources onto which I would want to apply some governance. I would go ahead and utilize resource group to be as my scope. If I have to go ahead and apply governance across all the resource groups which are falling under a single subscription, I could use this as a scope. So higher you move on, all the sub or the child categories would inherit and also allows us the level of scope. If I apply it on the root, all these scopes automatically fall under the governance. But to fine grain, there might be situations where I would not want to apply a certain restrictions across my organization, then I would not do that. Hence, to have a fine grained approach, I would want to have different level of subscription, I mean, different level of scopes onto which I can apply my governance policies using your resource groups, using your RBACs, using your Azure policies. You could have these in place, right? You could see I could have a single resource group. I could have multiple resource group under a subscription, under different subscription. The call is yours. The simple agenda is the reasons of having these. Either you want to group resources which share the same life cycle, you would want to group them on the basis of location, on the basis of billing, applying policies, uh, whatever your agenda is, you could go ahead and utilize these things over here, right? Now, if I talk about Azure policy and Azure RBAC. We have already seen that Azure policy helps us achieve what? If I would want to apply restrictions, apply governance, basically, say my organization need is that I would only want to operate in a particular region, let's say region 1. There are multiple regions offered under Azure. Now my organization requires to go ahead and operate only in a single region. Now the reason for that could be anything. That could be a budget constraint, that could be a, a compliance requirement where it says you will have to operate only in a particular region. The agenda of an organization could be anything, but let's assume that I would want to operate only in a single region. I do not want my users to go ahead and launch resources and any of the other available regions under Azure. How would I achieve that? And this is something which I would want to generalize no matter he's from which department, if he's falling under which management group, is coming under which subscription. I do care. Basically, my agenda is throughout my organization. Let's say I have to have a single policy where this restriction is applied. Now, how do I achieve this? Now, this is where we say, go ahead, utilize Azure policy and say that you would only want to allow launching of resources in region 1. And this is a policy what I have created. And where do I apply it? I would apply it on my root group. Now, once I have this applied on my root group, we have discussed your subgroups, your management groups, your subscriptions, your resource groups. Everybody inherits the policy, right? So similarly, if I want to fine grain the approach and say within this particular region, I would only want to deal with a particular service. Let's say I would only want to launch virtual machines, nothing else. Then I can have a policy created for it. Even more, if I want to fine grain it, I say within virtual machines, there are so many options made available by an organization. How would I go ahead and restrict them from utilizing something which is not required by my organization? So if I take an example, let's say my testing team and my development team came up with a solution saying that if you use an A series VM, the application what you are trying to run justifies this. The other services or other series of machines what are available is not of our use. So if I go ahead and utilize A series, my job is done. So what I can do, go ahead, create a policy saying that within virtual machines, my users should only launch A series machines, A series SKUs. How will I achieve all this? So basically, I would go ahead and apply policies for it at needed scope, at needed levels, right? So when we talk about designing, so this is where we are saying when we want to design governance in all these aspects, these are the tools and services what you will use and place them accordingly based on an organization need. So as we were talking about Azure policy, this is something which would play a role. We have got RBAC also. Now, RBAC is helping us do what? Again, when we have resources in place, now what can be achieved onto those resources? For an example, now I said I have my policy created saying that a particular VM can be launched, that is A series VM can be launched. Fine. I'm sorry. Now, what access could you give? What access could you allow for a user on that particular VM? Whether he can delete it, whether he can start it, whether he can stop it. What actions are you allowing him on those particular resources will be managed by your RBAC. So that is what, if you see, you have got when to use your Azure policy. As we discussed, I would want to give policies applied, right? A similar example, you can see that tagging is a feature, as you might have come across. That tagging is something which is referred as a best practice for us, right? So the best practice says that you in an organization, when you're dealing with multiple resources, it is best practice to go ahead and tag a resources, which allows the users to either basically manage resources in a structured approach, right? That could be in terms of managing the life cycle itself or managing the resources itself. We say your organization could be dealing with thousands of resources, and you might not be able to ideally manage those resources efficiently if there is no tagging services. Now, what do I mean by this? Now, let's assume that your organization is having thousands of VMs launched. Now, within those thousands of VM, there could be different workloads running on those virtual machines. Now, until and unless I don't have a way of identifying them at the base level itself, it is not possible for me to say what service is running onto that particular VM until and unless I don't launch that VM or get into that particular VM, right? So to simplify that process, what you can do, I can go ahead and tag that particular machine, right? Saying that this belongs to development environment, belongs to your production, is for your testing environment. Now, I'm just giving an example, right? Now, when you have tagging solution available and it is acting as an important aspect, now what when there are thousands of users and every individual user is creating a resource on their own in an organization, right? And let's say there are certain users who are strict in following the agenda of applying tagging, but there could be users who could accidentally miss applying tagging, or they might forget, basically have the tendency of forgetting of applying tags onto it. Now, this is something which could create problem in efficiently managing the resources. So what I can do? I need governance. I need everybody to follow the same approach across my organization. So go ahead, create a policy which says that when you are creating a resources, it is mandatory for you to give a tag value. If you don't give a tag value, either you have got the option of not allowing the user to create the resource itself, or you have a policy which can automatically inherit the tag value from the resource group into which that particular resource is being launched. Now, there are multiple approaches how you can utilize the tagging value, but the whole point what I'm making is when I have to generalize the approach of applying tags across my organization, then I can have a policy created for it and I can go ahead and apply that policy. Now, until and unless the user does not provide a tagging value, the resources are not created at all. So this gives you a layer of approach where you can manage your organization, govern your organization in a proper approach. So similar thing when we talk about your RBACs, where you would want to decide on the permissions, what you would want to allow for that particular user, for the set of resources, what you would want to give, right? Whether you want to make him an owner, whether you want to make him a contributor, whether you want him to be a reader. Well, all this is something which helps us have governance in place, right? Keeping all the other aspects, what we discuss in RBAC, that is, you will have to follow the least privilege policy. You will not allow the users to have the permissions apart from the required permissions, what they are approved for. That is nothing less, nothing more. You would only give the uh, required permissions and you will give the least possible requirements. Basically, let's say if you have got a VM and his requirement is only to have a read permission, it is not a proper approach that instead of giving a read permission, you make him a contributor or you make him a owner. Now, this brings challenges within. If you accidentally give a user the permissions what is not required. Now, it could be an intentional damage, or if the credentials of such users is getting compromised, you are compromising the permissions what the user holds, and this creates challenges, security concerns in an organizations, right? So to have all this in place, you will go ahead and utilize all this and govern your environment accordingly, right? Now, at last, we are talking about your Azure blueprints. Now, what is Azure blueprints basically? Now, till now, we saw that you have got policies, you have got resource groups, you have got different scopes for better management, right? Now, they were all acting as an independent resources, and you would have to address them accordingly. Now, what we are looking at is, if you see that users might be dealing with templates, users might be dealing with resource groups, you might be dealing with your RBACs. But what we are saying is, this was something which you were taking care of at an individual level. But in an organization, there could be an approach where it says that the set of services what we have here is something which will be more or less utilized by many users, and this has to be common across everybody in an organization. So what I can go ahead and do is I can bring in a layer in between to manage them, that is your blueprints, where under your blueprints you define your artifacts. Now, what are these artifacts? Now, let's say you have got test team, you have got development team, you have got your production team. Now there are set of resources and services and set of permissions and everything. Let's say from an point perspective of resource management, your RBAC roles, your policies and everything, right? Now this is different from what is available in your dev and prod. But under your testing team itself, there are multiple deployments which are happening. Now, when there are multiple users coming in and multiple testings happening, I would want a me, or it is very difficult for me to go ahead and apply these rules, policies, and everything for a new created environment in my organization, right? I will have to go ahead and reiterate everything for every new testing environment what my organization creates. So this is a challenge, administrative challenge for me. How do I overcome? Let's say there are certain set of templates which are predefined for testing environment. There are certain defined resource groups which you would want to utilize for your testing environment. There are certain RBAC rules which you would want to imply for the users who are under your testing environment. And there are certain policies which applies restrictions in utilizing set of resources. So we are saying you go ahead, create a blueprint, that is under your artifact, you define that this particular blueprint can be utilized by test environment. And when they go ahead and publish this blueprint, they automatically inherit all these predefined structure. All these predefined artifacts plays a role so that you don't have to create the policies, you don't have to recreate the permissions, you don't have to recreate the resource group, you don't have to redefine which templates to utilize. You are just defining the resources to be utilized by that particular department, and the required standard approach for that particular department is already in place. So basically, blueprints acts as the name itself suggests. Blueprint defines what set of resources to be utilized by which environment. So that could be for testing environment, that could be for development environment, that could be for your production environment. So you could say there is something predefined templates for dev environment, certain groups dedicated to dev, and this is what you have to utilize. So you define all that in your blueprint, and in turn when you launch these blueprints, all these parameters which are predefined would get executed, and you don't have to manage them again, is the approach of blueprint. So when your organization is dealing with multiple deployment scenarios and there are a lot of deployments happening and it requires a similar set of approach, you can go ahead and have blueprints in place, right? So this is in terms of your governance. So basically here we just try to understand that if I would want to bring in governance, efficient governance in my infrastructure, how I could use my management groups, how you could utilize my resource groups, your subscriptions, your Azure blueprints was the whole point, whole agenda. Hope we have got this. And for now, we'll mark an end to this particular chapter. See you in further. Thank you.